Plainly, however, whatever his motive and expectations, Ford misjudged the reaction of the country. He was taken aback by the blowtorch of anger that his actions set off. Tip O'Neill, his old friend in the House, said that it would cost Ford the 1976 election, a prediction that seemed borne out the very next day. The president flew to Pittsburgh to address a conference on urban transportation. Outside the hall, he was greeted by demonstrators shouting, "Jail Ford." Overnight, his approval rating dropped a record 22 points, from 71% to 49%. Of course, a month later, he went and testified before Congress, the first president, in fact, since George Washington, to do so. He did it voluntarily, and by most accounts, very successfully. But it was, again, a testament to the intensity of emotions that surrounded Richard Nixon, and in some ways, it almost explained why you had to lance the boil. Otherwise, play the game of what if. What if there hadn't been a pardon? What if the legal process had ground away and the next 2, 3, 4 years were monopolized by Richard Nixon's legal travails and a trial and a possible conviction and appeals? What would that have done to the country? I leave it to you. Ford spoke prematurely when he declared America's long national nightmare to be at an end. For the spring of 1975 brought the shattering climax of U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia, and with it unforgettable scenes of heartache and humiliation. Responding to a frantic request for help from South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, Ford dispatched Army Chief of Staff General Frederick Wayland to Saigon. He did not, however, go alone, and this is classic Ford. The president also sent White House photographer David Kennerly, an iconoclast and virtual member of the family, who, on observing his employer's ungraceful tumble down some rain-slicked steps while disembarking from Air Force One, had greeted the leader of the free world with the words, "Nice of you to drop in." And it was equally typical of Ford when all of his advisors, of course, thinking to curry favor, were denouncing the photographers for their act of lèse-majesté in taking his picture. And Ford said, well, of course they took my picture. If they hadn't, they would have lost their jobs. He was the least offended by the whole incident. If Ford wanted a Vietnamese report with the bark off, then Kennerly was the man to give it to him. He got precisely what he asked for. Cambodia is gone, Kennerly told the president on his return, and I don't care what anyone says, they are bullshitting you if they say that Vietnam has got more than 3 or 4 weeks left. His words were blunt enough, but it was Kennerly's pictures that most eloquently portrayed the tragedy engulfing South Vietnam and Cambodia. Some staff members even complained when these depressing images were hung in the corridors of the West Wing. Leave them up, Ford ordered. Everyone should know what is going on over there. On April 1st, Cambodia fell to the Khmer Rouge communists. Options for Vietnam were running out, as was congressional support for anything but immediate and total U.S. evacuation. And so began the most painful chapter in recent American military history, culminating in desperate attempts at escape by South Vietnamese who were quite justifiably terrified of communist reprisals. When shelling sealed off nearby Tan Son Nhut airfield, thousands stormed the American embassy in Saigon for 2 days, beginning on April 28th. Air Force and Marine pilots ferried over 7,000 Americans and Vietnamese from the roof of the embassy up that staircase on the second floor of this museum to the safety of waiting aircraft carriers in the Coral Sea. It was an ironic measure of his success in draining the poisons released by Vietnam and Watergate that by the summer of 1975, there were some journalists who had coined the slogan, "Stay bored with Ford." All that changed abruptly in the second week of September when Squeaky Fromm, a member of the notorious Charles Manson family, tried to assassinate the visiting president on the grounds of the California State Capitol in Sacramento. Ford, characteristically, went ahead with his schedule as if nothing had happened. He paid a neighborly call on the state's Democratic governor, Jerry Brown, in the course of which he never mentioned his near-death experience. As he put it afterward, "I didn't think it was appropriate for me to say, "On the way to see you, Governor, a lady tried to shoot me." How Midwestern. The man who insisted he had no enemies was discovering the brutal reality of the modern presidency. 2 weeks after his encounter with Squeaky Fromm, history repeated itself. While leaving a San Francisco hotel, Ford paused to wave to onlookers across the street in Union Square. The crack of gunfire resounded. This time his assailant was Sarah Jane Moore, a 45-year-old woman with ties to Bay Area radical groups. An alert bystander deflected the weapon, causing the bullet to miss its target by several feet. Press Secretary Ron Nessen declared, "We're never coming back to California again." Back in Washington, Betty Ford, the most outspoken White House feminist since Eleanor Roosevelt, pleaded with her children to look happy when their father appeared. Already bearing the weight of the world on his shoulders, he mustn't know how worried they were about his safety. Smiles mingled with tears as the president entered the room, looked at his wife, and declared, "Betty, those dang women are lousy shots." In the Midwest, pragmatism is a virtue, and the search for common ground is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness. In the words of the late, great Everett Dirksen of Illinois, "I am a man of fixed and unbending principles, and one of my principles is flexibility." The other half of Capitol Hill's long-running Ev and Jerry show felt much the same. Don Penny quoted the president as saying one day, "Don, it's okay for you to be an advocate, but you cannot be a zealot." There was nothing casual about that remark. After all, Gerald Ford and his generation had paid a high price for a world full of zealots. More than once I heard him say that it was sometimes necessary to question a man's ideas and even his methods, but rarely his motives and never his patriotism. In Congress, he had learned that there was no such thing as an enemy, just an opponent on this roll call who might be with you on the next. Over time, Ford learned, sometimes painfully, that the ways of Capitol Hill were not easily transferable to the presidency. In the Midwest, a man is as good as his word, and a handshake as binding as a contract. That's how Ford had operated in the House. That's how he tried to operate in the White House. 3 times, the president appealed to his former colleagues in Congress to deregulate new supplies of natural gas. For good measure, he urged them to establish a single ad hoc committee to review his 167-page energy package. Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield said the idea was impractical. Speaker Albert said he could do nothing, quote, to destroy committee jurisdiction. Were he even to attempt such a thing, the Speaker added, it would cause, quote, horrendous internal problems for Congress. Eventually, the White House and congressional leaders narrowed their differences. A handshake deal was struck to phase in decontrol over a period of 30 months. The deal lasted all of a week. Unfortunately, the Democratic leadership reported back to the president they could not deliver their membership. All this was symptomatic of post-Watergate Washington, wherein authority was flouted as hierarchies crumbled and visibility, above all, the mass legitimacy bestowed by television, was pursued as the holy grail of career advancement.